She was chained to a wagon outside my ranch. Now we eat together every night and folks don't know what to say. The desert wind was howling something fierce that October morning when I first laid eyes on her. I'd been up before dawn tending to a sick mare and the sun was just starting to paint the sky pink when I heard the creak of wagon wheels coming up the dirt road to my ranch. Now visitors weren't exactly common out here in the middle of nowhere, Texas. My spread was a good day's ride from the nearest town of Millfield, and most folks had sense enough to send word ahead before making the journey, so when I saw that weather-beaten wagon rolling up with nobody on the driver's seat, I knew something wasn't right. I grabbed my rifle from where it leaned against the barn door and walked out to meet whatever trouble was coming my way. The horses pulling the wagon were near dead on their feet, foam at their mouths and ribs showing clear as day. They'd been driven hard and long, that was certain, but it wasn't until I got closer that I saw her. She was sitting in the back of that wagon, chained to an iron ring bolted to the wooden bed. Her dress was torn and dirty, her dark hair hanging loose and tangled around her face. But when she looked up at me with those green eyes, there wasn't fear there like you'd expect. There was defiance, pure and simple. "Well, I'll be damned," I muttered under my breath, setting my rifle aside and approaching slow and easy. "Ma'am, what in the Sam Hill happened to you?" She didn't answer right away, just studied me like she was trying to figure out if I was friend or foe. Finally she spoke, and her voice was hoarse but steady. "You going to help me or you going to stand there gawking all day?" I couldn't help but grin at that. Here was a woman who'd clearly been through hell and she still had enough sand to sass a stranger with a gun. "Well, when you put it that way," I said, climbing up into the wagon bed to get a look at those chains. The iron shackles around her wrists were locked tight, and the chain connecting them to the wagon was thick enough to hold a bull. Whoever had done this to her hadn't taken any chances. "You got a name, ma'am?" I asked as I examined the locks. "Elena," she said simply. "Elena Vasquez." The name told me what I'd already suspected from her features and coloring. She was Mexican, or at least part Mexican, which explained a lot. These were dangerous times for folks like her, what with all the trouble brewing along the border and plenty of white men thinking they could do whatever they pleased to anyone with brown skin. "Well, Miss Elena," I said, pulling out my pocket knife to see if I could work at the locks, "I'm Jake Morrison, and this here's my ranch. Don't suppose you know who did this to you?" Her face hardened. "3 men. They said they were taking me to work off a debt my father supposedly owed them." She spat into the dust. "My father's been dead 2 years and he never owed anybody anything." That made my blood boil, but I kept working at the chains. The locks were too sturdy for my knife, so I climbed down and headed for the barn. "I'll be right back with some bolt cutters," I called over my shoulder. When I returned with the tools, she was looking around at my property with those sharp eyes of hers. It wasn't much to look at, just a modest ranch house, a barn, some corrals and maybe 50 head of cattle scattered across the scrubland. But it was mine, bought and paid for with money I'd saved up during my years as a cavalry scout. "You live out here all alone?" she asked as I started working on the chains. "Just me and the cows," I replied, concentrating on the task at hand. "Gets quiet sometimes, but I like the peace." The chains finally gave way with a satisfying snap, and Elena rubbed her wrists where the shackles had chafed them raw. She climbed down from the wagon on her own, refusing the hand I offered, and I respected her for that. "Those men," I said, "they still around these parts?" She shook her head. "They rode off after chaining me up. Said someone would be along to collect me eventually." Her voice turned bitter. "Guess they figured I'd just sit there and wait like a good little slave." "Well, they figured wrong," I said, unhitching the half-dead horses from the wagon. "Come on inside. You look like you could use some food and water." She followed me into the house, which wasn't much to speak of, just 4 rooms and a kitchen with a wood stove. But it was clean and comfortable, and from the way Elena's eyes swept over everything, I got the feeling she hadn't seen much comfort lately. I put coffee on to boil and started frying up some eggs and bacon. "You got somewhere to go?" I asked as I cooked. "Family somewhere?" Elena sat down at my kitchen table like she was testing whether it would hold her weight. "I did have a place in San Antonio, worked as a seamstress for a lady there. But those men," she trailed off, staring out the window at the endless desert beyond. "They burn you out?" She nodded. "Said I had to come with them or they'd hurt the family I was staying with, so I went." She looked down at her hand. "Lot of good it did. They probably went back and hurt them anyway. I set a plate of food in front of her and watched as she ate like she hadn't seen a meal in days, which she probably hadn't. Well, I said, settling into the chair across from her, far as I'm concerned, you're welcome to stay here as long as you need to figure out what comes next. She stopped eating and stared at me, just like that. You don't even know me. I know enough. I know you didn't deserve whatever happened to you, and I know those men had no right to treat you like property. I sipped my coffee. Besides, I could use the company. Gets mighty quiet out here. That was the beginning of the strangest partnership I'd ever been part of. Elena stayed, initially just planning to rest up for a few days before moving on, but as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that neither of us was in any hurry for her to leave. She was handy around the ranch in ways I never expected. Turned out she knew horses better than most men I'd met, and she could cook circles around me. More than that though, she was good company. She'd sit on the porch in the evenings while I played my harmonica, and she'd tell stories about growing up in Mexico before her family came north looking for a better life. It was about a month after I found her that we made our first trip into Millfield together. I needed supplies, and Elena said she was tired of being cooped up on the ranch. I should have known it would cause a stir, but I figured folks would mind their own business. I figured wrong. The stares started the minute we rode into town. Elena sat straight in the saddle, chin up and eyes forward, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. By the time we tied up in front of Morrison's General Store, no relation, despite the name, half the town was gathered on the boardwalk, whispering behind their hands. "Jake Morrison," called out Sheriff Hendricks as we climbed the steps to the store. "Heard you had yourself some excitement out at your place." "Nothing worth mentioning," I replied evenly, holding the door open for Elena. "That's so." The sheriff's eyes were fixed on Elena now. "Funny thing is, we had some men through here a few weeks back. Said they were looking for a runaway Mexican girl. Offered a reward and everything." Elena stiffened beside me, but I kept my voice calm. "Is that a fact?" "Well, I wouldn't know anything about that. This here's Elena Vasquez. She works for me." The sheriff's smile was thin as paper. "Works for you, does she? Doing what exactly?" "Same as anyone else," I said. "Whatever needs doing around a ranch." We went into the store, but the damage was done. By evening everyone in Millfield would be talking about Jake Morrison and his Mexican woman. The stories would get wilder with each telling, and none of them would have much to do with the truth. Elena bought what she needed without saying a word, but I could see the anger simmering behind her eyes. When we got back to the ranch that evening, she finally let it out. "Those people looked at me like I was something they'd scrape off their boots," she said, pacing back and forth across my kitchen floor. "They're just not used to seeing someone like you around here," I said, which was a weak excuse and we both knew it. "Someone like me." Her voice was sharp as a knife. "You mean someone Mexican? Someone brown? Someone who doesn't know her place?" I held up my hands. "I mean someone who isn't afraid to look them in the eye and let them know she's not ashamed of who she is. That scares people like them." She stopped pacing and studied my face. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why did you help me? Why did you bring me to town with you today when you knew what would happen?" I thought about that for a long minute before answering. "Because it was the right thing to do," I said finally. "And because I've spent too many years watching good people get ground down by bad ones. Figured it was time to make a stand." Elena nodded slowly. "And you're not worried about what they'll say, what they'll think?" I laughed, though there wasn't much humor in it. "Elena, I'm a 35-year-old man living alone on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. They already think I'm half crazy. What's a little more gossip going to hurt?" That night Elena cooked us both dinner, same as she had every night since she'd been staying with me. But this time felt different somehow, more permanent, like we'd crossed some kind of line in town that day, and there was no going back. The next few months tested that feeling plenty. Word spread fast about the Mexican woman living out at the Morrison Ranch, and it brought all kinds of unwanted attention. Some folks drove out just to get a look at Elena, like she was some kind of curiosity. Others came with warnings about harboring undesirable elements, and lectures about proper Christian behavior. The worst of it came from a group of men led by a rancher named Cotton Briggs, who owned the biggest spread in the county and thought that gave him the right to tell everyone else how to live. Briggs made it clear that he didn't approve of the arrangement and suggested, none too politely, that Elena would be better off somewhere else. "She's a distraction," he said one afternoon when he rode out with two of his men. "Got the whole county talking. Makes decent folks uncomfortable." "Decent folks shouldn't have anything to worry about," I replied, keeping my voice level. Elena's not bothering anyone. She's bothering me, Briggs said. And if she's bothering me, she's bothering a lot of other people too. I stepped off the porch, and Briggs's men shifted nervously in their saddles. I wasn't a big man, but my years as a cavalry scout had taught me how to handle myself, and it showed. Cotton, I said quietly, I'm going to say this once, and I want you to listen real careful. Elena Vasquez is a guest on my property and she's under my protection. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me personally. Briggs's face turned red, but he wasn't stupid enough to push things further with 3 against 1 on my own land. This isn't over, Morrison, he said as he turned his horse around. Mark my words. Elena had been watching from the kitchen window, and when I came back inside her face was pale. Maybe he's right, she said. Maybe I should move on. I don't want to cause you trouble. The only trouble around here is men like Briggs, who think they can bully folks into doing what they want. I said, you're staying, if you want to stay, and if anyone doesn't like it, they can go to hell. Elena smiled at that, the first real smile I'd seen from her since we went to town. You know, she said, my grandmother used to say that when God closes a door he opens a window. Maybe getting chained to that wagon was God's way of opening a window for both of us. Could be, I agreed, though I'd rather he found a less dramatic way to introduce us next time. That winter was hard in all the usual ways, cold, wet and lonely, but having Elena there made it bearable in a way I hadn't expected. She taught me to cook things I'd never heard of, using spices she grew in a little garden behind the house. I taught her to play chess, and she taught me card games her father had shown her as a child. Most evenings we'd sit by the fire after dinner and talk about everything and nothing. She told me about her dreams of opening her own dress shop someday, and I told her about my plans to expand the ranch and maybe run for county commissioner. We were comfortable together in a way that surprised us both. It was sometime around Christmas that I realized I was falling in love with her, though I kept that to myself. Elena had been through enough without me complicating things with unwanted romantic notions, but the feeling was there all the same, growing stronger with each passing day. Spring brought new challenges. Cotton Briggs had spent the winter stirring up sentiment against us, and by the time the weather warmed up, half the county was convinced that Elena and I were living in sin and corrupting the moral fiber of the community. The pressure came to a head during the Easter social at the Millfield Church. Elena had insisted on going, despite my warnings that it might not be the best idea. She'd made a new dress for the occasion, yellow cotton with tiny blue flowers, and she looked beautiful enough to stop traffic, which, as it turned out, was exactly what happened. The minute we walked into that church social, conversation stopped like someone had fired a gun. Elena took my arm and held her head high, but I could feel her trembling slightly. We made our way to the refreshment table, where Miss Patterson, the preacher's wife, was serving punch. Good morning, Mrs. Patterson, Elena said politely. What a lovely social you've organized. Mrs. Patterson looked like she'd swallowed a bug. Yes, well, she stammered. It's for church members and their family. I see, Elena replied evenly. Well, perhaps next year I'll be able to join the congregation and participate properly. That set off a whole new round of whispers. The idea of Elena Vasquez sitting in their church pews was apparently more than some folks could handle. But before anyone could say anything, old Mrs. Henderson, who was about 90 and feared nothing on God's green earth, shuffled over with her cane. Elena dear, she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, I've been wanting to talk to you about that embroidery work you did on my tablecloth. Finest needlework I've seen in 40 years. Would you consider taking on some more pieces? Elena's face lit up. I'd be honored, Mrs. Henderson. Wonderful. Come see me next week, and we'll discuss the details. The old woman turned to face the crowd, her eyes sharp as nails. Anyone else with sense would do well to recognize talent when they see it, instead of standing around with their mouths hanging open like a bunch of simpleton. That broke the tension somewhat, though we still got plenty of cold stares and whispered comments. But Miss Henderson's endorsement carried weight in the community, and a few other ladies approached Elena to ask about her needlework. By the time we left, she had 3 more potential customers. See? I told her as we rode home. I told you Mrs. Henderson was good people. She's brave. Elena, it takes courage to stand up for what's right when everyone else is going along with what's wrong. That summer was the best of my life, though I didn't know it at the time. Elena's sewing business took off, and she was able to contribute to the ranch expenses, which made her proud. We worked side by side during the day and sat together on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of orange and purple. The folks in town were starting to get used to us, though there were still plenty who disapproved. But Elena had won over enough of the ladies with her needlework and quiet dignity that the worst of the gossip had died down. Cotton Briggs still made trouble when he could, but even his influence was waning as people got tired of his constant complaints. It was in August that everything changed. We were in town for supplies when a stranger rode up and asked if anyone knew Elena Vasquez. My blood ran cold, thinking it might be one of the men who'd chained her to that wagon, but it turned out to be a lawyer from San Antonio, with news that Elena's aunt had died and left her a small inheritance. Not a fortune, the lawyer explained as we sat in his hotel room, but enough to give you some options. There's a house in San Antonio and about $500 in cash. Elena was quiet on the ride home, and I knew what she was thinking. The inheritance gave her the freedom to leave, to start over somewhere new where nobody knew her story. It was what she'd always wanted, the chance to build an independent life on her own terms. That night at dinner neither of us said much. Finally, Elena set down her fork and looked at me across the table. "Jake," she said, "I need to tell you something." My heart sank, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "I know, you're thinking about San Antonio." She nodded. "It would be a fresh start, a chance to open that dress shop I've always dreamed about." "That's what you should do then," I said, though the words nearly choked me. "Follow your dreams." Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her plate. Then she looked up at me with those green eyes that had captivated me from the first day. "The thing is," she said softly, "somewhere along the way, my dreams changed. I used to think I wanted to be independent, to prove I could make it on my own. But now," she trailed off, then took a deep breath, "now I think what I really want is a home, a real home, with someone who sees me for who I am, not what I am." My heart started beating again. "Elena, I love you, Jake Morrison," she said, her voice steady and "I've loved you since that day you defended me to Cotton Briggs, maybe even before that, and if you'll have me, I'd like to stay here and build a life with you." I was around that table and pulling her into my arms before she finished speaking. "Of course I'll have you," I said, holding her close. "I've been in love with you for months, but I was afraid to say anything. Didn't want you to feel obligated or trapped." She pulled back to look at me, her eyes bright with tears. "Never trapped," she said. "Free, for the first time in my life, completely free." We were married the following month in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with Mrs. Henderson standing up as Elena's matron of honor and old Doc Wilson serving as my best man. About half the county showed up, including some folks who'd been coldest to us in the beginning. Miss Patterson even brought a cake, though she still couldn't quite meet Elena's eyes when she congratulated us. Cotton Briggs didn't come naturally, but he sent word that he was moving his operation to California, where a man can live among his own kind. Most folks seemed to think that was the best news they'd heard all year. That was 5 years ago now. Elena's dress shop in town is thriving, and our ranch has grown to include 150 head of cattle and some of the finest horses in the county. We have 2 children, little Maria, who's 3, and baby James, who just turned 1. Elena says we'll probably have more, and I hope she's right. The folks in Millfield have long since accepted us as part of the community.